All right, hello. We're back. We're going to read some more Madison Grant's Conquest of a Continent. Last I read it was, I think, 2 weeks ago. Last week I just wasn't really feeling like streaming, but we're back. And we did the first two chapters. And why am I getting an error on YouTube? Well, whatever. I think it's fine. So yeah, we read the intro in the first two chapters, and he kind of laid out his idea of the migrations across Europe, the racial groups that make up European people, and then now he's going to talk about that some more here, and we're going to talk about. I think we're finally going to get to America, so we're going to try to read these next two chapters and see where that leaves us, but I think that'll be good for today. So we'll just start with chapter 3 here. And I just ate, so I'll probably have to mute the stream a few times. I always cough a lot when I eat. I don't know. But anyway, like I said, we're going to start with chapter 3 here. So we have the Nordic conquest of Europe. About 1300 BC, a blonde, blue-eyed race of Libyans appeared in Egyptian sculptures. Whence these blondes came or how they got into Libya is not known. But it is interesting to note that blonde Berbers are to be found today in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. These, however, are probably more recent arrivals from the north. About 1800 BC, traces of Nordic infiltration appeared among the Hittites. These Nordic conquerors later entered Mesopotamia as the Mitanni and the Kassites, although it may be that they were only the ruling classes of these people. In recorded history, the Nordics first appear in the west as Achaeans. They came from the north, from the Dacian plains, and conquered Greece and Phrygia about 1400 or 1500 BC. About 1200 or 1300 BC, the Nordic people, the Osco-Umbrians, sweeping down from the northeast, entered Italy. They were kindred to the Achaeans, and were the ancestors of the Latin tribes, including the early Romans. The aboriginal Mediterraneans were driven into southern Italy, where, in Calabria and Apulia, they persist to this day. The contrast between the peoples of North and South Italy is still profound. We have a footnote here. The Geographical Lore of the Time of the Crusades by J.K. Wright of the American Geographic Society, page 320. The author says, quote, "In these authorities we find that the differences between the inhabitants of the northern and southern parts of Italy were fully appreciated in the 12th century. The Lombards, Gunther says, are a keen, skillful, and active people, foresighted in counsel, expert in justice, strong in body and spirit, full of life and handsome to look upon, with slight, supple bodies that give them great power of endurance, economical and always moderate in eating and drinking, masters of their hands and mouths, honorable in every business transaction, mighty in the arts, and always striving for the new, lovers of freedom and ready to face death for freedom's sake. These people have never been willing to submit to kings, but what a contrast the people of Apulia in the south present to the Lombards, dirty, lazy, weak, good-for-nothing idlers that they are." End quote. Damn. So back to the text. The continental Nordics, as Celtic tribes, entered Gaul in the 9th century BC. From the evidence of place names, they passed through South Germany. All Gaul except Aquitania in the southwest was overwhelmed. Spain was conquered by Celtic Nordics about 600 BC, but their domination was never complete, and they soon mingled with the natives. The mixed inhabitants of the peninsula were called Celtiberians by the Romans. During the same period, the British Isles were overrun and thoroughly occupied by Celtic Nordics named Goidels, and the Celtic tongue was imposed upon the Mediterranean population. although the latter survived as a race in large numbers, especially in the western parts of England and Ireland. These Celtic-speaking Mediterraneans were, until recently, called Iberians. But 1500 years ago, the invading Saxons called all the people they found in England Welsh. In about 300 BC, a new wave of Celts entered Gaul and Britain. This time they came from the German plains, speaking a somewhat different form of Celtic. On the continent, they were known as the Belgi, and in the British Isles as the Brythons. They gave their name to the British Islands. By Caesar's time, they had conquered the northern third of Gaul and all of England, but the Roman armies put an end to their farther advance. They did not reach Ireland. Roman writers describe the Celts in Gaul as pure Nordics and speak of them as forming the ruling classes and military aristocracy until their virtual destruction by Julius Caesar in his 10 years of conquest. His campaigns in Gaul are said to have destroyed 1 million men, chiefly of the warrior caste. At the time of their greatest expansion, the Gauls sacked Rome, 387 BC. They pressed no farther south and soon retreated to and remained in Cisalpine Gaul, that is, the valley of the Po and the country north of the Apennines. The Nordic Gauls, or Galatians, to use the Greek form of their name, devastated Greece about 297 BC and passed over into Asia Minor. There they settled in what was long known as Galatia, now Angora, the present seat of the Turkish government. These Galatians were the last Nordics to enter Asia Minor, if we accept the armies of the Crusaders. From the description of the physical characters of the Celtic-speaking tribes, they closely resembled the Germanic tribes that followed them into the Roman Empire. 1 second. I don't know how long my throat is going to last today. Hopefully we can get through these 2 chapters. Anyway, continuing on. Some French anthropologists find that the present-day population of France is nearly 4/5 Alpine, and they have decided to call the Alpines Celts to avoid admitting that the Celts were physically the same as the hated Germans. This error is not shared by the leading French anthropologists, such as de la Puge, but it has been accepted by some anthropologists. Careful study of the references to the Celts by classic writers leaves no doubts that the Gauls, Galatians, Belgi, and Brythons were Nordics, as were their successors, the Visigoths, Suevi, Alemanni, Burgundians, and above all, the Franks. In fact, France, down to the time of the Reformation, was a Nordic land. Soon after the time when the Belgi first appeared in Europe, Nordic tribes speaking a Germanic dialect are mentioned in history. The first of these tribes to come in conflict with the Romans were the Teutons and Cimbri, who after defeating several Roman armies were utterly destroyed in 103 BC. These people were the forerunners of many tribes and nations which emerged, one after another, from the swamps and forests of the north. The original home of most of them seems to have been in Scandinavia, where they had been developing for several thousand years. These newcomers were the latest and final linguistic group to appear in the history of Europe. As Teutonic Nordics, they have dominated the scene ever since. The use of the word Teutonic is here purely linguistic, in order to distinguish these latecomers from the earlier Celtic-speaking Nordic tribes. The Teutonic Nordics formed a substantial element among the Belgi and Brythons, and their expansion may well have been caused by the westward thrust of the latter. The Teutons began to press southward on the Roman Empire early in the Christian era, and this pressure continued for some 3 centuries until the empire collapsed under their successive invasions. As said above, the Celts and the Teutons were identical physically, and the use of the word Celtic cannot be justified as a racial term at the present day. Among living Nordics, those of Celtic origin cannot be distinguished physically from those of German or Scandinavian extraction. Possibly red hair and the psychical peculiarities associated with it may be rather more Celtic than Scandinavian. We find in classical writers the names and description of the barbarians beyond the borders of the empire. They were all described as blue-eyed, fair or red-haired giants. Height, however, must be considered as relative to that of the Romans, whose legions in the later years of the empire were apparently composed of small men. With each generation, the names applied to the barbarian tribes change, but the description of physical characters remains the same. Yeah, I think the average height in ancient Greece was around 5'3", so I assume Romans were about the same. The finest of these Teutonic barbarians were the Goths, who, according to their historian Jordanes, crossed over from Sweden about 300 BC and settled on the banks of the Vistula, whence they expanded into South Russia, which they occupied for centuries. In fact, a remnant of their language, Krim Gotish, was spoken in the Crimea until the 17th century. The Gepidi were a branch of the Goths who lay to the west of the main body, and the Alans, a closely related tribe, were located well to the east. It is interesting to note that some of the Alans, fleeing from the Huns, took refuge in the Caucasus, where the Ossets to this day, or Ossetes, I don't know, show occasional Nordic physical characters. The main body of the Gothic nation was split in two in 375 AD by the invasion of the Huns, a Tatar people from Central Asia. Those who took refuge in the west and South Germany and Gaul were called Visigoths. A part of the Visigoths, however, fled across the Danube, devastated the provinces of the Byzantine Empire, and slew the reigning emperor Valens in 378 AD. The eastern branch, or Ostrogoths, were conquered by the Huns and remained in Dacia. Later, after Attila's death and the disruption of his empire, the Ostrogoths, under the great Theodoric, invaded Italy and came to building a unified Italian nation nearly 1400 years ago. The Visigoths, who had been long in contact with Roman civilization, occupied Gaul. When Attila crossed the Rhine in 451 AD, they fought on the side of the Romans at Chalons, one of the decisive battles of history, and their king, the Visigothic Theodoric, fell in battle. The Ostrogoths, on the other hand, were the best troops of the Hunnish host. The Visigoths entered Spain in 412 AD. Their allies, the Suevi, conquered and ruled Galicia and the provinces on the Atlantic, which now constitute Portugal. The invasion of Spain by the Visigoths resulted in the expulsion of a closely related Teutonic people, the Vandals, who, with their allies, a remnant of the Alans, crossed over into Africa in 428 AD. On the site of Carthage, the Vandals erected a kingdom which lasted 100 years. They ruled the African coast westward of the Atlantic, conquered and settled in Corsica, and under their king, Genseric, sacked Rome in 455 AD. These Vandals, originally from Sweden, first appear in history on the Baltic coast. Thence they passed down through Central Europe and westward into France, and thence into Spain, where they settled and remained until they were driven into Africa. They may have left some of their blood to mingle with the later coming Germanic tribes in Spain. It is possible also, though not probable, that to them are due some of the blonde characters still found in the Atlas Mountains. As a race, however, their disappearance is complete. The Visigoths maintained their control in Spain until 711 AD, when the Mohammedan Arabs crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and completely defeated the Visigothic armies. Why the power of this people collapsed so suddenly and completely is one of the mysteries of history. But after the great 7 days battle on the Guadalquivir, in which their king Roderick was slain, the whole peninsula was easily conquered by the Arabs. At this time, it is true, the blood of the Visigoths had been greatly mixed with that of the subject races, resulting perhaps in a weakening of their fighting power. One of the reasons for the easy conquest of the Visigoths by the Moors lay in the hatred for them as Aryans by the old Orthodox Catholic population, who regarded their conquerors as heretics, and the assistance rendered by the Jews, whom the Visigoths had treated harshly, and who are reputed to have induced the Moors to make their invasion. And I need my tea to hurry up and cool down so I can get a drink. Anyway, a remnant of the Visigoths fled northerly into southern Gaul, which was called Gothia Septimania. There the name Visigoths was corrupted into Viget or Bigot, which was a term of reproach used by the Orthodox natives. It is important to note that there are relations between the populations of the Roman Empire and the invading Teutonic Nordics were greatly affected by the fact that the latter were the followers of the schismatic monk Arius, who, about 350 AD, converted the Goths to a Unitarian form of Christianity. The denial of the Trinity by the barbarians roused a fierce hatred among their subject peoples. Ostrogoths and Visigoths, Vandals and Alans, Burgundians and Lombards were all Arians. The Franks alone among the barbarians were converted directly to Orthodox Christianity. This greatly facilitated their conquest of Gaul. In consequence, France, for more than 1,000 years, was regarded as the eldest son of the Church. Down to our time, the aristocracy of Spain, and more especially that of Portugal, shows a marked inheritance of blondness, coming down largely from Visigothic and Suevic ancestry. The province of Galicia still retains very appreciable marks of Gothic blood, especially in a high percentage of light-colored eyes. The Visigoths left behind them in Spain a legacy of names which now are regarded as most typically Spanish, as for instance Rodrigo, Alfonso, Alvarez, Guzman, and Velasquez. In the same manner, we find a Nordic legacy of names reaching from Italy into France, even where little Nordic blood is left. In other words, while blood dies out, names persist. At the time of Spanish greatness, the predominant blood in the peninsula was still Gothic. And there's a footnote here. The Spanish popular heroes Don Rodrigo and the Cid Campeador were Gothic, to judge by their names, as was the brave crusader Count Raymond of Toulouse. L. Wilser has called attention to the number of Gothic names still in use in the Iberian Peninsula. Alfonso or Afonso, Alonso, Gothic Athalafons. Alvaro and Alvarez, Gothic Alaver. Bermui, Gothic Baramud. Bertrand, Gothic Bertram. Diego and Diaz, Gothic Theoderic Dietrich. Esmeralda, Fernando and its genitive Fernandez, Gothic Ferdinands. Froilas and Fruela, Gothic Fravila. Gelmires, Gelimer, Gomez, Gothic Guma. Gonzalo and Gonzalez, Gothic Gunthamir, Gundamar. Gilfonso, Gothic Villafuns. Guzman, Gothic Godeman Gutman. Ildefonso, Gothic Hildefons. Isabella, Marquez, Gothic Marquia. Menendez, Gothic Hermananths. Mundez and Munez, Gothic Mundilla. Pizarro, Gothic Pizzas. Ramiro, Gothic Radomir or Ragnamir. Ramon and Renmondez, Gothic Ragnamund. Rodrigo and Rodriguez, Ruiz, Gothic Ruderiks. Cisnandas, Gothic Cicinand. Vasco and Vasquez, Gothic or maybe that's Vasque. Velasquez, Gothic Velasquia. See page 107, volume 2 of the book Die Germanen by Dr. Ludwig Wilser. And I've definitely been butchering a lot of these pronunciations, like of all the Gothic tribes, but I definitely fucked all those up. But anyway, continuing on, I'll just start the paragraph over again. At the time of the Spanish greatness, the predominant blood in the peninsula was still Gothic, and the adventurers who went overseas and were lost to the race were of this blood. In Portugal, the one great poet, Camões, in Spain, Cervantes, who was his contemporary, were descendants of the old Gothic nobility and had marked Nordic characteristics, as had the Cid Campeador. Describing Camões, George Edward Woodbury says, quote, "He was of the old blue blood of the peninsula, the Gothic blood, the same that gave birth to Cervantes. He was blond and bright-haired, with blue eyes, large and lively, the face oval and ruddy, and in manhood the beard short and rounded, with long, untrimmed mustachios, the forehead high, the nose aquiline, in figure agile and robust, in action quick to draw and slow to sheath. And when he was young, he writes that he had seen the heels of many, but none had seen his heels. Born about the year 1524, of a noble and well-connected family, educated at Coimbra, the university famous for the classics, and launched in life about the court at Lisbon, he was no sooner his own master than he fell into troubles. End quote. The case was the same in Italy at this period, and there's another footnote. Wilser cites Wiltmann's essay, Have the Goths Disappeared in Italy?, which shows that even in the latter part of the Middle Ages, many people lived according to Gothic law, that in some cities there even existed Gothic sections, and that many Gothic names can be traced as Stavilla, Nephila, Luia, Hermia, Hilpia, Ansfrida, Gilifridis, Totila, and Villa. Just stop giving me a list of names to read, please. Where was I? All right, back to the text. The great men were from the northern part of the peninsula. Dante, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and virtually all of the leading men of the Renaissance from blonde Nordics. Columbus himself, supposed to have come from Genoa, is described as having blue eyes and fair hair. In southern France, in the so-called Gothic Septimania, and the country around Toulouse, the home of the troubadours, Gothic names abound. Oh, God, there's another list of names. Okay, we're going to read this footnote again. Some more names. All right. Footnote 5. In fact, almost all the names of the troubadours are Teutonic, says Wilser, giving the following examples of French names from the Teutonic original in parentheses: Arnaud, Arnold, Aymeric, Bernhard, Bertrand, Bertram, Gauselm, Wilhelm, Gautier, Walter, Guillaume, Wilhelm, Gerald, I don't know, Gounod, Vito, Geoffrey or Joffre, Gottfried, Raymond, Ragimund, Rambau, Ragenbald, Rudolph, Savaric. See page 107 of this book that he keeps quoting. Hopefully that's the last list of names that I have to butcher. All right. A similar condition prevails throughout France. French names are Gothic, Frankish, or Burgundian today. They're disguised by their spelling, as, for example, Joffre from Gottfried. In the opinion of Count de la Puge, France, as late as the settlement of America, was more Nordic than is the Germany of today. The main body of the Visigoths, who survived the conquest by the Arabs, took refuge in the northwestern part of Spain, where they maintained some small kingdoms which ultimately coalesced and became the nucleus of a Christian Spain, which, in the course of a 700-year crusade, gradually reconquered the peninsula and finally expelled the Moors in 1492. The Arabs who conquered Spain and the Islamized Persians and Moors had a wonderful period of intellectual expansion during the 7th and following centuries. This amazing outburst of genius, which preserved for us much of the science and learning of the Greeks, came to an end when the Mediterranean Mohammedans began mixing their blood with that of their Negro slaves. Mohammedanism has always appealed to the lower races, especially the Negro, because when they became followers of the Prophet, they were admitted to social and racial equality with the superior race. This and the lure of the Negro women ruined the Arab race. Today, all through Africa and Egypt and in parts of Arabia, the so-called Arabs are often Negroid in appearance. In this case, polygamy was a racial curse because the richer and abler men had the most slave women and left a larger progeny of half-breed children than did their poorer countrymen. The exact reverse happened in the case of the Turks, who were originally Alpines from Central Asia, strongly mixed with Mongol. They conquered Asia Minor and the nations of Southeast Europe up to and including Hungary. Everywhere they seized the most beautiful women, and, being polygamists, the ablest Turks had the most children by the finest women of the subject countries. Thus the Turks spread up as the Arabs spread down. To this day, the Turks are the superior race in Asia Minor, and have eliminated, at least from the ruling classes, practically all the physical traces of their Asiatic origin. The women of the Caucasus, especially the Circassians and Georgians, who retain some remnants of the Nordic Alans, have always been noted for their physical beauty. They were in great demand in Turkish harems. Incidentally, the Kurds are, or rather were, Nordic, and it is interesting to note that Saladin, of crusading fame, was a Kurd. Concerning other Teutonic Nordics, we need mention only those whose blood enters largely into modern nations. Of these, one of the most interesting peoples were the Burgundians, who settled on the western bank of the Upper Rhine, in what is now Alsace, and in Burgundian France and French-speaking Switzerland. They were a very promising and flourishing nation until their overthrow in the middle of the 5th century by Attila and his Huns, a tragedy which supplies the subject matter of the Nibelungenlied. Yeah, that's a good book, by the way. All right, continuing on. Apollonius Sidonius refers to the Burgundians as being 7 feet high. While this is an obvious exaggeration, it is interesting to note that the old Burgundian provinces we find the tallest stature in France today. When the Lombards first appear in history about 165 AD, they were in northern Germany. They entered Italy in 568 AD and conquered the peninsula even more thoroughly than had their predecessors, the Ostrogoths. They not only occupied Italy north of the Apennines for 300 years, but also established several large duchies in the south. The valley of the Po, where they settled, had been for centuries Cisalpine Gaul, and this Lombard territory is today the backbone of modern Italy. The percentage of light-colored eyes around Milan is high. The blondness through this district is as common a characteristic of the peasantry as it is of the aristocracy throughout the rest of Italy. The Lombards were Arians, and were in constant conflict with the popes and their Orthodox followers, and were consequently generally maligned. Just as a similar situation facilitated the conquest of Spain by the Moors, so the destruction of the Lombard kingdom by the Franks was made the easier by this antagonism. In passing, we need only remark that there were small bands of other Nordics who entered Italy as Saxons, Alemanni, and Suevi, and who entered France as Alans and Saxons. These small bands differed in few respects from the larger Nordic peoples, and were quickly absorbed in them. All these barbarian tribes were closely related racially. Before we leave the Alemanni who occupied southwest Germany with Alsace and German-speaking Switzerland, we may note that their name, Alemanni, did not mean all men, in the sense of a mixed company, but rather the men par excellence, the German all being the analogous of the Greek pan. We come next to the Franks, who appear in history about the time of the Battle of Chalon in 451 AD, in which they took an unimportant part. But in the following centuries, they rapidly gained the ascendancy throughout Gaul and western Germany. The conquests by the Franks are the most important and enduring of those of the Teutonic Nordics in continental Europe. We know very little about the Franks from the Romans, although they may have been the Verini, who were located in northwestern Germany in classic times. As a result of the Crusades, Roman Orthodox, as contrasted with Greek Christians, are known as Phalangi to this day in the Levant. Being Orthodox Christians and not Arians, the Franks had the support of the Roman Church in all their conquests. The Flemings of Belgium are remnants of the original Franks who retained their own language. Most of these invaders, like the Franks, Visigoths, Lombards, and Normans, adopted the Latin language of their subject peoples when they settled within the confines of the Roman Empire. Except in eastern England and northern France, the numbers of the conquering Nordics were not sufficient entirely to evict and replace the conquered populations, but they everywhere formed the upper classes and landowning aristocracy. And to this day, these same classes in all European nations continue to show, in more or less periody, the physical characters of the Nordic race. During the Middle Ages, the dominating and warlike Nordics paused long enough from fighting each other to carry on the Crusades and to beat back the onrush of the Saracens at Tours in 732 AD. They saved Europe from the Mongols in 1241 AD, and at the Battle of Liegnitz, now Wallstatt, in Silesia, where the Duke of Liegnitz and the Nordic nobility, outnumbered 5-1, lay dead upon the field of battle, but checked the advance of the Asiatic hordes and saved the budding civilization of Europe from the fate of Asia. This race supplied the navigators of the expansion period, when the world was for the first time opened up in the 15th and 16th centuries, and since then they have formed the fighting men, soldiers, sailors, explorers, hunters, adventurers, and frontiersmen of Europe and her colonies. After mastering the north of France, the Franks subjugated the remnants of the Burgundians and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom, which still flourished in the south of Gaul. They also conquered the country on the east bank of the Rhine, known as Franconia, and under Charlemagne seized northern Italy. In 800 AD, Charlemagne revived the Western Roman Empire, which under various guises lasted down to 1807. Charlemagne's greatest and most difficult conquest, however, was that of the Saxons, who were pure Nordics. They occupied the districts of northwest Germany, centering in Hanover, and even today, this part of Germany is still the most Nordic portion of that country. When Charlemagne reached the Elbe in his conquests, he found beyond it the heathen Alpine winds, and from his day down to the World War, the history of Central Europe has been the pushing back of the frontier of Alpine Asia from the Elbe eastward toward the Urals. These eastern lands were conquered and little by little Christianized and civilized from the west. This process went on as far as the Vistula, where it met the Greek Orthodox religion of the Byzantine Empire, which had followed up the rivers of Russia from the Black Sea and had given to Muscovia and the Ukraine their religion, alphabet, and art. The Northmen were the last of the Nordic barbarians to appear on the scene, and in the 9th and 10th centuries, they raided the coasts of Europe from England to Greece. They established themselves as permanent settlers on all these Scottish islands and on many parts of the Scottish coast. In Caithness, the northernmost corner of Scotland, Norse was spoken as late as the 17th century. They formed settlements and left place names all around the coasts of Wales and England. In the 10th century, as Danes, they subjugated northeastern England and imposed their rule east of the line of Watling Street, which runs from London to Chester. These Danes had barely been overcome by the Saxons when a new group of Nordics arrived as Normans from France and conquered England in 1066. Ireland was attacked by the Norse, who came in from the north, and the Danes, who entered from the south. The island was overrun by these two peoples, who have left many traces in the place names and in the blood of Ireland. On the continent, the coasts of France and Germany were harried by the Northmen, and the country, since called Normandy, was conquered by them in 911 AD. The Danish conquest of England, referred to above, must have been largely Norse, while in France, Rollo's followers were probably to an overwhelming extent Danes. The Norman element in England, and to some extent in America, down to this very day, has supplied a very large proportion of the conquerors, seamen, explorers, and frontiersmen. This same ruling and restless strain showed itself in the individual adventurers who went to South Italy and Sicily, which they thoroughly conquered in the 12th century. They even attacked the Byzantine Empire. To this day, Blue Eyes in Sicily are called Norman Eyes, and are to some extent characteristic of the upper classes there. It was in this period that the Norse rovers under Leif Erikson discovered the northeast mainland of America about 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus, who probably knew of their voyages across the Atlantic. At the time of this Norwegian and Danish expansion, there was a similar outpouring of Swedes who, as Varangians, crossed the Baltic into Russia, which they conquered and ruled for many centuries. The name Varangian is strongly suggestive of Varini, or Franks, and the name Russian means rowers. The Varangians came across the seas precisely as their ancestors, the Goths, had done 1,000 years earlier. After the expansion of the so-called Viking period, Scandinavian activities came to an end. Man undoubtedly crossed back and forth on dry land from Europe to England in Neolithic and earlier times. In fact, some of the earliest records of man have been found in England, and the recent discoveries in Norfolk of chipped implements and hearths show that man made tools and used fire in England before the appearance of the first glaciers, something over 1 million years ago. These early species and genera of men largely died out or were exterminated and were succeeded at the beginning of Neolithic times by invasions of the small, dark, long-skulled Mediterranean race, which for many thousands of years formed the basis of the population of England, Scotland, and Ireland. About the beginning of the Bronze Age, some 1800 BC, a tall, round-skulled type from the continent, called the Beaker Makers, appeared on the scene in England. They resembled somewhat the present Dinaric race, a tall, round-skulled branch of the Alpines now found from the Tyrol southward to Albania on the east side of the Adriatic. It is clear that the Beaker Makers entered from the east across the narrow seas, and their remains indicate a tall, masterful type, which seems to have disappeared to a large extent, although some of the round-skulled, heavily built Englishmen, found numerously among the commercial classes, maybe they're representatives today. The racial composition of the British Isles when the Nordic first appeared on the scene may be safely said to have been composed of small brunette Mediterraneans, interspersed with a small number of round-skulled types, and including very probably remnants of still earlier races. The Celtic-speaking Nordics appear to have crossed the Rhine into France and the countries to the southwest about 800 BC. At about the same time, they forced their way into the British Isles, which they thoroughly conquered. These Nordics were called the Goidels, or Q-Celts, and their language is represented today by the remnants of Erse in Ireland, Gaelic in Scotland, and Manx on the Isle of Man. These Q-Celts, as contrasted with the later incoming P-Celts, are now represented by the Max, meaning sun, just as the later Cymric or Brythonic Celts are called P-Celts, because in their language, ap means sun. The Aborigines were called Picts in Scotland. These Mediterranean Picts spoke a language related to Hamitic or Egyptian, and many places of this origin are still to be found. It is not definitely known whether the Gaelic speech of Scotland is a remnant of early Goidel invasion, or whether it was reintroduced from Ireland in the early centuries of our era. The latter appears probable, because the second conquest by the Celts was nearly complete throughout Britain, although it did not reach Ireland. The second subjugation of Britain was by the P-Celts or Brythons, speaking a Cymric form of Celtic. It occurred in the 4th century BC, and was so thorough that it was not probable that remnants of the earlier Goidelic speech could have survived in Scotland. These Brythons were represented on the continent by the Belgae, who, in Caesar's time, occupied Gaul between the Rhine and the Seine. A remnant of their speech survives in Brittany as Armorican. The P-Celts gave their speech to all England, and remnants of it are found in the recently extinct Cornish and Cornwall and the Cymric of Wales. Both the Q-Celts and the P-Celts were, on their arrival in Britain, pure Nordics, but in many cases they soon merged with the Aboriginal population. They were everywhere the ruling military class, in Britain as well as in Gaul. Having imposed their language on the conquered people, they died out almost completely, leaving, as in Wales, their speech on the lips of the little Mediterranean native. Whatever truth there is in the legends of King Arthur and his resistance to the Saxons, they clearly indicate a blonde Celtic aristocracy ruling over an underclass of small Mediterraneans. The same condition is indicated in Irish legends, where the Celts appear as a distinct fair-haired military class. The next Nordic invasion of Britain was by the Saxons from the country around the present Duchy of Holstein, by the Angles and Utes from farther north on the mainland of Denmark or Jutland. These tribes, which entered England in the 5th century, were probably more Nordic than the continental Teutons, and this was true of the Norse and Varangians of a later date. Their conquest was almost completed during the century after their arrival, but there was sufficient resistance in the western part of England to postpone its final subjugation for several centuries. However, gradually the population of practically all England in the lowlands of Scotland became purely Nordic. This racial stock was reinforced by the invasion of Danes, who occupied most of northeast England. The Norsemen settled around the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, England, and especially Wales, and added a very considerable contribution to the pure Nordic element of the population. The next and last invasion of Britain by the Nordics was the Norman Conquest of 1066. The Norman leaders and soldiers were pure Nordics from the most Nordic part of France. In fact, the Normans were heathen Danes speaking a Teutonic tongue when they arrived in Normandy in 911 AD, so that on coming to England they had been in France only a little over 150 years. In those years they had accepted Christianity, had learned French, and had become the exponents of the highest culture in Europe. Into England they brought with them many followers of Alpine origin, and the clergy whom they imported is also composed very largely of Latinized Alpines. At this point we may remark that Wales, especially along the coasts, has a very large Nordic population. It is absurd to distinguish between England, Scotland, North Ireland, and Wales, as is done in the census of the United States. We might just as well distinguish between North England and South England on the ground that the first is Anglian and Danish, and the other Saxon and Jutish. The lowlands of Scotland are pure English territory, and have been such for 1,000 years. The Ulster Scots who came to America were only 2 or 3 generations removed from the Scottish and English borderers, and had not mixed with the native Irish. It is also to be remarked that the Norman conquest of England was that of one Nordic people by another, and that Great Britain and Ireland constitute a group, the membership of which is overwhelmingly Nordic in its racial inheritance. At the time of the discovery of America, all Europe was far more Nordic than it is today. Germany at that time had not witnessed the expansion of the Alpines of the south and east, which is characteristic of the present era. In England, before the Industrial Revolution created a demand for little brunette Mediterraneans to drive spindles, the Nordic had the field to himself. As farmer, soldier, sailor, explorer, and pioneer, he was preeminent. The brunette Mediterranean element, formerly called Iberians, had been forced back into the extreme west of England and into Wales, and was not an important economic or political factor, nor was there any considerable immigration of that racial stock into the American colonies. These were settled primarily by the descendants of the Normans, Saxons, Anglians, and Danes, coming from the distinctly Nordic districts of the motherland. Norfolk and Suffolk were settled by the Angles, and afterwards formed a part of the Danish kingdom. As said above, the lowlands of Scotland and the English borders were Anglian and Dane, while the coasts and islands of Scotland were everywhere Norse. The highlands were Celtic, with an admixture of Norse, Anglian, and Norman. There were also remnants of the old Mediterranean populations, probably Picts. Curiously enough, these Mediterraneans contributed their dark eyes and hair color, but not their short stature. The population of West Scotland has the greatest height of all the peoples of Europe. Ireland, like England, was settled as we have seen originally by the Neolithic Mediterraneans. They in turn were conquered by the Goidelic or Q Celts, blonde Nordics who imposed their language on the Aborigines in the 9th century. Ireland was overrun by the Norse and Danes, whose descendants today constitute a very considerable portion of the population. The very name Ireland is Danish. Most of the big blonde Irish of today, though they like to claim Celtic descent, are in fact Norse, Danish, Saxon, Norman, or Scottish derivation. The Nordic elements in Ireland were reinforced again and again by the English and Normans, who, from the days of their original entry into the island down to our day, have formed the great majority of the nobility and upper classes of the country. The Celtic Goidel in Ireland today is a negligible quantity which cannot be racially identified. The brunette elements in Western Ireland, though to some extent Celtic in speech, are descended from the old Neolithic or Mediterranean population of the British Isles, mixed with a primitive Aboriginal race of great antiquity, the Firbolgs. Ireland has shown a singular power of absorbing its conquerors. The descendants of Danish, Norman, and English settlers consider themselves pure Irish Celts. It is a strange fact that the English, Scotch, Norman, Danish, and even the French Huguenots who have settled in Ireland have acquired and have handed down an extraordinary temperamental unity. As to language, by the time of Elizabeth, the English Pale constituted a part of eastern Leinster, and there English was uniformly spoken. The English language ultimately spread over the whole of Ireland, leaving only a few remnants of Celtic speech in the extreme west. From the times of James I to those of William III, large numbers of English and Scotch borderers passed over to the northeast corner of the island into the province of Ulster. They were fervent Presbyterians and hated the native Catholic Irish. It was the sons and grandsons of these immigrants who came to America in the 18th century and are sometimes miscalled the Scotch Irish. They had special grievances of their own against England on account of economic restrictions imposed upon their industries. Before this time, a large number of Cromwellian soldiers had settled in Leinster, but not having their own women with them, they intermarried with the Catholic Irish, and their descendants today are most intensely Irish in national feeling. The Reformation never had much hold on Ireland, so that the Catholic Irish today represent the mixed population of Ireland before the 16th century, together with numerous converts from the Scotch and English immigrants. With this brief survey of the distribution of the Nordic race in Europe, down to the time of the discovery of America and the beginning of emigration to the colonies of the New World, we can pass on to one of the most dramatic mass migrations of man. From West Central Asia, where it was in contact with the Mongoloids on the east, the Nordic race pushed across Europe to the extreme western coasts. We shall show how it traversed the Atlantic Ocean, and then, in 3 centuries, subdued a continent. Generation after generation, it fought its way westward until it reached the Pacific Ocean, where today it stands confronting Asia and its immemorial rivals, the Mongols, this time on the west. And that's it for chapter 3. So that described, the migrations across Europe. And also, we saw some more of his thoughts on how you can eliminate a race through breeding. It's kind of politically incorrect today, but when he was talking about like the Arabs mixing with the Africans and the Turks mixing with Europeans, that's kind of what he was getting at before last time we were reading. Now we also know the origin of the round-skulled middle-class British phenotype, the swamp dweller. So I'm going to try to drink some of my tea. Hopefully it's cool enough now. It's pretty hot still, but I think it's drinkable. So we're going to take a little tea break here. My throat doesn't do well with these reading streams, but I still like to do them. It gives me an excuse to read an interesting book that I've been neglecting. So I've owned this for like a year, I think. I got it off eBay and just haven't read it. So it's a good excuse to do it. I've mostly been using this channel as an excuse to play video games that I've wanted to play but never did. So why not do the same thing with books, All right, I think this chapter is a little shorter. I think we'll get done probably by like the hour and a half mark. I think this goes to like page 80. Ooh, we got a map. Okay, that's nice. In case you didn't know where Ireland was, there it is. Yeah, okay, it goes to page 80. Oh, the map's not included in the page numbers, so I was thinking, oh, it's shorter than I thought, but it's really not. Oh well. All right. I'm done coughing for now, so we'll go Chapter 4, The Nordic Settlement of America. Before considering the question of the origin of the English settlers of the Atlantic seaboard, it is important to understand the motives that actuated the newcomers. The impelling motive of the settlers who crossed the ocean to America from the earliest colonial times down to 1880 was land hunger, and just as we speculate in stocks today, so down to 100 years ago, our ancestors speculated in lands on the frontier. It is difficult to realize the extent to which the ownership of the land in Europe was monopolized, largely through the exercise of royal favor, by the upper classes in the 17th and 18th centuries. This established English tradition and practice brought to America by the early settlers, coupled with the favoritism of the royal governors and land grants, was one of the causes which led to the Revolution. After the American victory, much land was confiscated on the plea that the owners were loyalists. The distribution of free land in the United States came substantially to an end about 1880, when the public domain became exhausted. Up to that date, the immigration into America had been assimilated readily. Certain exceptions will be dealt with later. Practically all of it was from northwestern Europe, and the immigrants came mostly of their own volition. It took some degree of enterprise to leave home, cross the Atlantic, and establish oneself in a new country amid strange surroundings. Settling new land meant clearing the forests and destroying the game, as well as buying off or fighting the Indians, whose ideas about land ownership were vague. To the frontiersmen in early days, the term a clearing was synonymous with a settlement. Religious motives and the desire for political and economic independence, of course, were also great factors in the Pilgrim and Puritan migration to New England from 1620 to 1640. The New England Puritans represented only a part, and relatively a small part, of the exodus from England. They were pure English from the most Anglo-Saxon part of England, and consisted largely of yeomen and the lesser gentry, who found the religious and political conditions in England under the Stuarts intolerable for freemen. They were essentially dissenters who refused to bend the knee to prelate or to king. In 1640, the Commonwealth, the Puritans seized the reins of government in England and only permitted the return of royalty in 1660 under conditions which established for all time the supremacy of Parliament. In fact, during the Commonwealth, the power of Parliament had become so great that many of the best minds of England felt that a restoration of the monarchy was needed as a check. The settlers of New England may be regarded as essentially rebels against established religion and established authority when their religion and authority were not of their own choosing. This nonconformist spirit persisted in the successive new frontiers as they were settled by New Englanders. The early New England settlers of western New York and the Old Northwest Territory gave birth to an astonishing number of new sects, religions, isms, and communities, ranging all the way from Mormonism to Shakers in the Oneida community. They were, however, law-abiding in their own way, and murders and crimes of violence were relatively infrequent. This is in sharp contrast to the southern frontiersmen, who were and are addicted to killings and physical violence. That, however, is chiefly true of the inhabitants of the Appalachian valleys, who always have been lawless. The descent and predisposition to rebellion among the New Englanders dates back to the Puritans in England, and the lawlessness and violence of the Ulster Scots to the endless border warfare on the Scottish frontier. The southern frontiersman was originally a Presbyterian, but he found his religion too intellectual for isolated communities and turned in many cases to the more emotional creeds of the Methodist and Baptist. The hatred of England by the Ulster Scotch frontiersmen dated back to the unjust and oppressive interference with their industries in the north of Ireland, as well as to a deep-seated impatience of all authority. After the Revolution, this hatred of authority was transferred to the Tidewater aristocrats and was accentuated by the debtor complex, which has characterized all our frontiers. The character of the frontier from the very beginning remained the same. Each generation of the restless, the discontented, and the failures pushed west, carrying with them some of the fine qualities of the original settlers of the seaboard, but more often developing a new complex of intolerance for the restraints and usages of older communities. There is an amusing and significant evolution of these traits in families who settled around Massachusetts Bay and then moved to the Connecticut Valley, thence to Vermont, western New York, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, and Los Angeles, where they now flourish. At the time of the Revolution, the intense hatred in New England of the mother country was due partly to a desire to confiscate the lands of the Loyalists, and partly to that which they considered unfair restrictions on their overseas trade, as well as to an unwillingness to being taxed to pay a part of the great cost of conquering Canada. The net result of these forces was a widespread anti-British and later anti-governmental complex, which has characterized our country ever since. In contrast to England and to Canada, we are an essentially lawless people. Here's that map of Ireland here. So we'll probably refer back to this at some point, maybe. But we can see there's Northern Ireland here. And then there's Leinster, which you mentioned before. Munster. So it's like 4 main regions, I guess, of Ireland and Ulster. I don't know how deep into it he's going to go, if he's going to be talking about like each individual little district here. But we'll see. We might refer back to this. In the North, the Revolution was largely a movement of various Calvinist communities, the few Episcopalians in New England, and the more numerous adherents of that church in New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland were almost all Loyalists. In Virginia, however, and further to the south, the numerous Church of England planter class took the American side and as a result retained their leadership as an aristocracy down to the time of the Civil War. Even at the time of the Revolution, this church contributed more than its quota of leaders. Of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 34 are classified as Episcopalians, 12 as Congregationalists, 5 as Presbyterians, 2 Quakers, 1 Baptist, and 1 Roman Catholic. Of the Continental Congress, which ratified this declaration, nearly 2/3 are said to have been Episcopalians. Hello, Hernan. In the North, following the expulsion of the Loyalists, the Church of England was left prostrate, and it was some time after the Revolution before it was successfully reorganized and was definitely designated as the Protestant Episcopal Church to become, after a century, the fashionable church of the Atlantic seaboard. The Protestant Episcopal Church has never had any substantial hold in the Middle or Far West, and even today, it is there largely a missionary church with a tendency towards ritualism, which has checked its normal development. The Roman Catholic population of the colonies was negligible. In 1790, out of a white population of a little over 3 million, there were not more than 35,000 Catholics in the United States. This number included 5,000 Negroes and some Germans. They were located for the most part in Maryland and Pennsylvania, showing that the South Irish Catholics had not come over in appreciable numbers during colonial times. Many of the colonies legislated against Roman Catholics. The Revolution itself was political and social, carrying to an extreme development the political theories of the English Whigs. The distrust of officialdom and power engendered by the Revolution led to all manner of constitutional and legal restrictions, in place of a reliance on the personal character of office holders, as in England. During colonial times, 2 distinct types of population developed. First, the older communities along the Tidewater districts, closely in touch with Europe and having a long tradition of culture and wealth. Second, a type grew up on the frontier, which from the very beginning showed itself intolerant of the control of the older and richer settlements. This found its expression in Shays' Rebellion in West Massachusetts in 1786 and 87, in the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania in 1794, and, still earlier, in 1770, when the regulators in North Carolina were in open rebellion. After the Revolution, this tendency became more and more marked until the then West, under Andrew Jackson, took over the control of the country and, with many unfortunate results, carried Jefferson's ideals to an extreme. The Revolution emphasized this second attitude of mind and resulted in the loss by expulsion of some of the best Nordic blood in the country. The Loyalists from Boston, for instance, comprised many of the oldest and most distinguished families. The representative families of that city today are not descended wholly from the aristocratic colonial families, but largely from the population of the small towns and villages in its neighborhood. It is said that a total of 80 to 100,000 Loyalists left the colonies and went to Canada and England and to the English West Indies. New England, to a greater extent than any other colony, had been at war with France and her Canadian Indians for the best part of 150 years, but the memory of this prolonged and bloody struggle was obliterated by the Revolution. In its place, there arose in America a sentiment for France, caused largely by the romantic personality of Lafayette, which survives to this day. The Jeffersonian emotional sympathy with the French Revolution also played a large part. The fact, nevertheless, is that we had a naval war in 1798 with the French, although no formal war was declared. It was caused by French depredations on American commerce, resulting in several duels between American and French frigates. All this is conveniently forgotten or ignored in some of our school textbooks. And I'll take a little tea break here. All right. Let's get back to it. The earliest permanent settlements of importance in New England were around Massachusetts Bay and in Virginia along navigable streams. From such centers, settlements spread up and down the coast until all the desirable lands accessible to salt water became occupied. In New England, the coasts of southern Maine, of Rhode Island, and of Connecticut were quickly occupied. Migration then went overland from Massachusetts Bay westward to the Connecticut River. This was our first real northern frontier, and it took more than a century to populate southern and western New England. The settlement of Connecticut westward was blocked by the colony of New York, while the Indians delayed the advance of Massachusetts to the north. Connecticut, in turn, threw out colonies at an early date, such as Newark and New Jersey in 1666. Vermont was not settled until just before the Revolution, owing to the danger from the Indians and a serious dispute between New Hampshire and New York as to its ownership. At the time of the Revolution, it was a typical frontier with all of its bad features. At that time, it was about as rough and tough as Kentucky or Tennessee. After the Revolution, some of the best of its population migrated to western New York, along with settlers from all over New England, who went for the most part through Vermont. Early in the 18th century, nearly all the desirable lands within reach of salt water had been occupied from New Jersey southward, and later coming immigrants were forced back into the uplands of the West beyond the so-called fall line at which the Atlantic rivers ceased to be navigable. New York interposed an absolute bar to westward migration because the Iroquois Indians held almost all the fertile lands to the west of the Hudson River. The east bank of the Hudson was more or less filled up with New Englanders, and the west bank with its undesirable lands was turned over to late-coming immigrants, chiefly Germans. The Dutch population of New York was but small. The total population of the colony at the time of its seizure by England in 1664 was little more than 10,000, and there were already many English among them. The English settlers occupied both banks of the Delaware around Philadelphia, forcing the later coming Germans and Ulster Scots to the west. The Swedish settlement along the river was trifling and was soon absorbed. There was very little trace of it left in place or personal names. On the upper reaches of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania and in New York, there were some small settlements of French Huguenots who suffered severely from Indian depredations during the Revolution. Delaware and the country east of Chesapeake Bay are purely English, as was Maryland, except that western Maryland was really part of western Pennsylvania and western Virginia. Virginia itself was the mother of states, and in colonial times extended in fact, as other countries did in theory, to the Mississippi, without mentioning claims to the South Sea. The tidewater population of Virginia differed profoundly from that of the western part of the state, including the Shenandoah Valley, which was settled largely from western Pennsylvania. There was a marked difference between the settlement of New England and that of Virginia. To New England, the earliest settlers brought their women and families, while in Virginia the earliest arrivals were nearly all males. Women were afterwards sent over by the shipload, but this was only during the early days of the colony. Like Virginia, North Carolina in colonial times extended nominally to the Mississippi. Its population lacked the tidewater aristocrats of the Old Dominion and contained many Scots straight from the Highlands who strangely took the British side during the Revolution, as well as a very large number of Ulster Scots in the western mountains and in the counties which were afterwards Tennessee. Kentucky and Tennessee were both settled from the colonies immediately to the east, but largely by the Ulster Scots coming from western Pennsylvania through the mountainous districts of Virginia and North Carolina. These Ulster Scots came south along the Appalachian valleys, which trend in a southwesterly direction. They were reinforced by the numerous groups of the same people who came up from South Carolina. Kentucky was much more purely English than Tennessee. It is a fact, but little understood, that the frontier was not much reinforced from the coast, but extended itself. In other words, the frontier from the beginning was pushed onward by the backwoodsmen, each generation advancing a little further westward and making new clearings. The people along the coast, after a couple of generations of severe privation, became relatively rich as compared with the frontiersmen. The inhabitants of the coast cities, for the most part, preferred a seafaring life rather than the hewing out of a homestead in the wilderness. There have been many cases in our colonial history where men went from the coast towns to the wilderness, but for the most part they were content to stay at home. As to the original racial complexion of the colonies, New England was purely Nordic and English. The handful of Ulster Scots in New Hampshire was not to be distinguished from the English, and the individual Huguenot families around Boston were only trifling in number. This remained true of all New England during the colonial period. In New York, however, conditions were different. Dutch New Amsterdam, afterwards English New York City, was always an important port, and attracted to itself from the earliest times a substantial number of foreigners. In addition to the Dutch founders, a considerable number of French Huguenots were among the earlier settlers. There were also a few Germans and Portuguese. The west bank of the Hudson was less accessible and desirable than the east bank, but there were some substantial colonies of Palatine Germans settled there and up the valleys of the Mohawk and its connecting streams. These last played a creditable part in the heavy fighting which raged in this district with the British settlers, who were for the most part loyalists. There were also some small colonies of pure Scotch along the Mohawk. One of the results of the Revolution was the expulsion of the Iroquois Indians, who had occupied New York westward from near Albany to Buffalo. They had sided with the British and had committed many atrocities. Their lands were immediately occupied by New Englanders, coming chiefly from or through Vermont, so that New York State, west of Albany, became little more than an extension of New England, except that the settlers had become Presbyterians. Many of the colonists who came to New York from Holland were refugees from the provinces now included in Belgium. In other words, they were either Flemings or French Huguenots. The real Dutch in the province came from the north of Holland and were mostly Nordic Frisians. In addition to the large migration from Ulster, very many English Protestants from Leinster came to America by way of New York immediately after the Revolution. The Catholic Irish did not come in any numbers until after 1845. The Huguenots were predominantly Nordic. For example, New Rochelle in New York was settled directly from Old Rochelle, which is, even today, one of the purest Nordic districts remaining in France. It is entirely safe to say that the Huguenots from Brittany, Normandy, and Picardy, who came to the American colonies by way of England and Holland, were overwhelmingly Nordic. Some of those from southern France were probably Mediterranean. I'm going to take a little tea break again before we get on the final stretch here. Only a few pages left. So we're still mostly talking about the migrations from Ireland. We haven't really talked about anywhere else yet, really. So Ulster, if you remember, was like the North Ireland, and Leinster was like the southeastern part. All right, we'll continue on here. Outside of the port of New York, the Dutch population was confined to the Hudson River towns, chiefly on the east bank, up to and including Albany and Schenectady. The Dutch element of New Jersey was very small. New Jersey was almost all English, except a few Scotch settlements. It was settled directly from England by way of Perth, Amboy, Elizabeth, and Freehold in the north. South Jersey was settled from Pennsylvania. There were a few German communities scattered throughout the north-central part of New Jersey, but on the whole, the state can be counted as purely English. The case of Pennsylvania was somewhat different. The original settlers on the west bank of the Delaware, around Philadelphia, were English Quakers, with a certain number of Welsh, who probably were for the most part Nordic. This section was the most cultured and important part of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was the port of entry of two important migrations in the 18th century. First, the Ulster Scots, who came in great numbers after 1720. In fact, most of the Ulster Scots in America entered the colonies through Philadelphia and, to a less extent, through Charleston, South Carolina. These latecomers found the desirable land along the Delaware had been taken up, so they moved westward to the Indian frontier. They were a restless, brave, and pugnacious people, and immediately assumed the burden of Indian fighting, often without the support or even the sympathy of the Philadelphia Quakers. They were numerous and soon spread along the foothills and valleys of the Appalachians southwestward through western Maryland and Virginia into North and South Carolina, whence they again crossed the ridges westward, until by the time of the Revolution they had laid the foundations of Kentucky and of Tennessee. They were, of course, pure Nordics and of North England and lowland Scotch origin. They had resided for 2 or 3 generations in North Ireland, being fervent Presbyterians. They had not mingled with the Catholic Irish. In 1790, these Ulster Scots in the colonies numbered about 200,000, and the pure Scots about 300,000, and taken together they were, next to the English, the most important element. They were, as said above, preeminently pioneers and Indian fighters, and the same fact appears in the history of practically every frontier of British colonies during the next century. They were a highly selected group when they first went to Ireland, which was, at that time, to all intents, a frontier. Since that time, the Scots and the Ulster Scots have everywhere shown the characteristics of the ideal pioneer. They played a predominant part in the settlement of the southern part of the Middle West. The next most important racial element was the Germans. In fact, it was the only non-British element of importance in the colonies. At the time of the Revolution, the Germans numbered about 250,000, and by 1790, they have been computed to have been about 9% of the total population of the colonies. They settled in the districts of Pennsylvania immediately west of Philadelphia, around York and Lancaster, where they are to be found today. They were a peaceful and industrious people, and have to some extent retained their language and customs down to the present time. A very few of them joined their neighbors, the Ulster Scots, in the migration to the southwest. They were not particularly loyal to the American cause during the Revolution, nor in the preceding French wars, and their presence in the colonies excited much hostility. They were refugees who had fled down the Rhine from Alsace and the Palatinate, to escape the French when Louis XIV invaded and devastated their country. With them were many refugees from German-speaking Switzerland, together with Hussites from Moravia. While there were some Lutherans and Calvinists among them, most of the Pennsylvania Dutch, as they were called by the English colonists, belonged to small and obscure sects. Dunkards, Schwankenfelders, Amish, and Mennonites still maintain their special religious communities. Their language is Alemannish, and this German dialect is still spoken in Alsace and Switzerland. In addition to their colonies in Pennsylvania, there was a small settlement of Moravian brothers in the western part of North Carolina. Maryland was originally settled under a charter to Lord Baltimore as a refuge for English Catholics, but from the beginning these latter were very few in number, and by 1690 were so thoroughly outnumbered that they were deprived of the franchise. Virginia, the most important of the colonies next to New England, if the latter be taken as a whole, was pure English, and the Tidewater District, that is, as far west as Richmond, beyond were many Ulster Scots, who, it must be remembered, were very largely English. North Carolina was much the same, except that the Ulster Scots were relatively more numerous. South Carolina had an English planter aristocracy. It was much purer English and had less Ulster Scotch than her northern neighbor. It had also a considerable French Huguenot element, by far the largest and most influential in the colonies. These Huguenots, while not very numerous, were nearly all men of culture and social standing, and played a large part in the development of the country. Georgia was substantially of the same racial complexion as South Carolina. And that's it for Chapter 4. So that's going to be it for today. I do think an interesting thing to look back on here, and I'll drink some tea. But an interesting thing to look back on here is in America there was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which laid out who could immigrate to America and become a citizen. And it was limited to what they said, free white persons of good character. And this gets brought up a lot nowadays in the immigration debate. And people in opposition to that idea will say, oh, well, back then, Irish people weren't considered white, and Italians weren't considered white, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see in his writing, he considers all of these people white. So that's really just kind of like a myth. I don't really know where it comes from, that they wouldn't be considered white. At the time, they considered Jews to be white even. So, Italians and Irish were also lumped in the mix. It was pretty much anyone from continental Europe and England, like the UK. But, yeah, it's just an interesting thing that comes up nowadays still. And you can see and hear where they're all just different subsets of white people. And a lot of his racial classifications might seem kind of dated, but I read something pretty recently about how the races of Europe are like three distinct groups. So maybe not quite the same as Madison Grant lays out, but he does, he has the three groups. He has the Mediterraneans, the Alpines, and the Nordics. And I'm not sure exactly where the science puts these three groups. So it might be a little different, but I think it's pretty interesting that, those things line up at least. They didn't have DNA back when this book was written. They didn't really know anything about that. I don't think DNA was even discovered yet. I think this was written, what, in 1933? Let's see, when was DNA discovered? All right, so it was first identified in 1869, but it wasn't really understood until 1953. So they still had a ways to go, and without any of that knowledge, he kind of came up with these ideas just based on history and archaeology. So I think I always think it's interesting to go back and look at what people knew and what people figured out in these old books before they had, kind of modern methods to refine it. And they were still pretty close a lot of the time. So it's interesting. But anyway, that's it for now. We'll go back to the table of contents. I think it's on this page. See where we can get to next time. Maybe the next 2 chapters. So we read about 40 pages today. Maybe a little over 40. And then that'll be about 50, which isn't bad. So this has been pretty quick reading so far. There's not a lot of text on the pages, so 50 pages isn't actually that bad. I mean, I remember when I was doing the Federalist Papers, I would do like an hour and a half or 2 hour stream, and that would be like 20 or 30 pages of the book. But we're going through this pretty quickly. So, yeah, that's it. Tomorrow I plan to stream probably Mega Man X8. Gonna start that. And then next week it'll be more of the same, most likely. So thank you for being with me again today. And I'll see you all tomorrow for some Mega Man X8. Bye.